Αγνή παρθένε δέσποινα, αχράντε Θεοτόκε. Υψηλότερα ουρανών, ακτίνων λαμπροτέρα.
Hello and welcome to the Byzantine SCOTUS. Hopefully people like that new intro. I'm going to keep working on it. Just something I threw together last night. But what I wanted to do today is review a really great video series that I watched recently and just recommend people pick it up. And this series is the Foundation Restored series, which it was worked on by the Kolbe Center. So for those who don't know, the Kolbe Center is a Catholic apostolate focused on promoting traditional Catholic views of creation. And so it's a young earth creationist Catholic organization. And they have lots of great articles on their website. And so for their, to help educate people on these issues, they put together a video series called Foundations Restored. And so one of my followers very nicely gave me access to their videos. And so I wanted to go through and review them. For them. I think this is such a wonderful series. So there's 17 modules in this series. It's about 17 to 20 hours of content. So even though you might look at the list price and it looks a little high at first, you are getting a huge amount of content and it's all very well done. So our first episode is just an introduction to the series. So it lays out its goals. It sort of defines some basic terms. I didn't think this episode was all that important, but you have to start somewhere, so it worked as a good intro. But I think really the best episode in the entire series is episode 2. And they call this the Cartesian-Darwinian narrative. And so this series wants to look through what's the scientific worldview that we used to have, both at pagan times and then in Catholic times, and then now. So they first start off with pre-Christian views, and they talk about quite a number of important non-Christian views, especially ideas such as atomism or Epicureanism, and they especially walked through, Lucretius. And this was to me the most fascinating part. So Lucretius was a Roman poet who seems to be somewhere between a deist and an atheist. I'm not familiar enough with Lucretius to make a judgment. And from a little bit of background research I did for this, I could tell there was some debate within the scholarship about him. But he writes a work called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. And he's an atomist, so he believes that things are just composed of little molecules, which the Greek called atom. Atomos is just Greek for indivisible. I don't think we should make a one-to-one correlation, by the way, between the ancient Greek view of atoms and modern science picking up that word. That's a whole separate thing that I want to get into here, but it's important to note this atomist view. He thought what basically there was for all time is particles flying around for eternity, bashing into one another. And he suggests if you give this enough time, as you have infinite amount of time here, you're going to form lots of different creatures that get formed by the combination of these. And he talks about how in the past there were all these monsters. From the sense I got from it, I'm thinking that he's probably picking this up a little bit from Greek mythology and trying to say we have, we had all these great monsters in the past, but why aren't they around now? Well, they weren't fit, so they died off. And so he suggests then the creatures that we have today are the ones that were formed by these random combinations of things that were well suited to their environment, and they survived till today. And so we should realize that evolution is not a modern concept. Darwinism is not a modern concept. A lot of the evidence and arguments for it are modern, but the original idea itself is quite old. And they point out, interestingly, that the church fathers are extremely hostile to this sort of view when they come on the scene after the time of Christ. And someone's pointing out here, Lucretius was 90 BC, so this is before the time of Christ. So when the church fathers were around, they knew about evolution and they critiqued it. They thought that this was a pagan way of viewing the world because they thought it was denying God's causal role within the world. But I think what was most interesting in the video then is their presentation of the view that reigned for a long time during the Christian era. And this view is what they call the creation providence model. So over the first 6 days, there is special creation, God creating new forms ex nihilo and forming in this prime matter created on the first day. And after that, starting on the 7th day, we're in an age of providence where things move naturally as they always do. And so we can't simply take our scientific studies of the time of providence and apply them to the time of creation. And also, those who want to use principles from the period of providence philosophically to argue for a Catholic view of evolution are missing the important distinction between creation and providence, that creation is a special creation, something that doesn't happen after the first 6 days. And then after that, they then go into the Cartesian-Darwinian narrative. And a lot of what I just laid out about the creation providence model really comes up in episode 3. Episode 3 is 2 parts. So part 1, they just lay that out. And part 2, they go into St. Augustine, and St. Augustine is often appealed to. And they show that St. Augustine held the same view pretty much as all the other fathers on this matter. For Augustine, all it is that special creation is instantaneous, with the 6 days being a metaphor. But St. Augustine, probably even more strongly then, denies that the period of creation is the same as the period of providence. These two have to be treated separately. Then after that, they go into the Cartesian-Darwinian narrative. So how do things mess up if we have this great model of the creation-providence framework? And they say this really starts with, they bring up Montaigne. So Montaigne is a skeptic and starts really doubting whether all the scholastic knowledge we've built up can really be all that useful. And they argue this is because of the influx of pagan texts during the Renaissance. I don't know how much I fully agree with that part there, but we can go with that story. I think what's important is that in this period of the Renaissance, there's a growing doubt about scholastic teaching and the method of scholasticism. And that now denying scholasticism as sort of this bringing to perfection of the synthesis that the fathers had started. And the Renaissance, of course, wasn't all bad. There was lots of good people during the Renaissance. But there also is this growing doubt, and especially Montaigne, I think, was a good example of this doubt to bring out. So philosophy then has to be regrounded on something more certain. And this is what Descartes comes along and does. Descartes says we have to ground everything in pure reason. We have to start from first principles and walk forward again. And so Descartes ends up saying that we have to separate faith and reason into different categories. Faith can't help inform reason. Faith has to be off in its own separate category. Descartes does believe the Christian faith, at least he says so, but he says that the truths of the Christian faith can't be used in philosophy. They then go on from here to argue that this ends up informing Darwin's view, because what happens by the time we get to Darwin is that we can no longer bring about theology into the question. there is no option except for Darwinism. It's the only game in town for the naturalist, because the naturalist has to argue for a natural explanation of how everything came about. They can't possibly accept that it could have been made through divine intervention. And this conclusion wasn't reached, they argue, through the evidence, but rather the philosophical presupposition that this had to be the case. This is not to say at this point, then, that someone couldn't be atheist and hold to Darwinism, but rather one couldn't be an atheist and not hold to Darwinism. And even according to this model set up by Descartes, hopefully they represent Descartes right. I don't know Descartes well enough to know whether or not they're representing him fairly. But as I understand their presentation of him, they're saying that this had to already remain separate. This already was ruled out from the beginning before we had anything. All right, so then we go on also to then discuss how does Darwin input this. And they go into how there was actually quite a bit of a coercive model to get Darwinism within place, and not a physically coercive, but rather they used the pressure of trying to get the scientific community to ridicule anyone who wasn't a Darwinist very quickly. Instead, they had to actually set up new magazines, like, for example, what was it? Nature magazine, for example, so that they could push Darwinism in these sources and try and push away older publications to try and get the power of Christianity out of the scientific world and make everyone a Darwinist. They also note here, I don't remember how much they go into, and this is something I think they should have emphasized more, maybe a little bit, is the role of Lyell within this whole story, because they do mention Lyell a number of times. We should remember that Darwin didn't come about and create Darwinism out of nowhere. He first had to have the long ages around in order to have the long ages that evolution could happen in. And that work was done by Lyell arguing for uniformitarianism. And they do dedicate a later video to critiquing uniformitarianism, but I wish they had mentioned that maybe a little bit more within this philosophical video. Overall, though, I think this philosophical video is so important because it's something that's not talked about in a lot of the Protestant critiques of evolution. Because a lot of the Protestant critiques are still ultimately working within a modern philosophical framework. And so I'm really glad that they introduced the philosophy side of it. So they then went after, as I said, into some of the traditional Catholic views from looking at the fathers. And they also have a good episode on the Magisterium. And they show over and over again lots of points of the Magisterium where the Magisterium is pretty much always vindicating a literal reading of Genesis, or where they don't necessarily explicitly vindicate it. They do allow it. So they argue that Humanae Generis has opened up a period of discussion within the church on the matter of evolution, but it hasn't necessarily determined that we have to now accept evolution. And they do go through and show the scientists, the times Pius XII and John Paul II made positive statements towards an old earth or evolution. These are always in private speeches. And so that can't be used as high-level magisterium as other magisterial statements, such as the Pontifical Biblical Commission, such as papal encyclicals. And they also show how the magisterium has vindicated, including at Vatican II in De Verbum, the exegetical method of searching primarily for the literal meaning. They ultimately vindicate the creationist approach to reading a lot of these passages, and the exegetical method by which we get there. And so that was very good. From there, they now switch over to science. So starting in episode 5, this is really video 6. So they've had some two-parters now. They have an interesting episode called The Failure of Evolutionary Icons, where essentially they pick out the sort of textbook examples of evolution. So things like Darwin's finches, and whales walking originally, and things like that. And they ask, do these actually hold up? And they argue that when you actually closely analyze all these different examples, there's a lot of nuances the textbooks aren't picking up, ways the experiments were done wrong, ways that the scientific opinion has actually shifted against them. And they don't, what I really liked about their arguments here is that they draw all their arguments actually from secular scientific journals. So they're trying to show, and they also cite lots of textbooks that are being used in Catholic high schools. So they use, I think his name is Ken Miller, if I remember correctly. They use, let me look that up so I get his name correct. Hold on. Yeah, Kenneth Miller is a Catholic biologist who's very critical of either creationism or even intelligent design. And they go through and compare his textbooks with what actually is taught, what actually is the popular opinion within lots of these scientific journals, and show that there's a lot more nuance that's being missed. And I thought that that was very good, and I'm glad he did that. My major concern with this section, I was worried there was going to be too much of a focus in this series on debunking evolution. This is often what happens. We go on the offensive, and it's a lot easier to debunk something you disagree with than defend something you disagree with. Let's see. Yeah, and so I'm glad that they do go into later on positive arguments scientifically for creationism and how we actually do interpret the evidence, and don't only focus on critiquing evolution. So I did like that as well. We now go into an episode 6, which is split into 2 parts. The first part I really liked, which was on the failure of the Darwinian mechanism, where they argue essentially for genetic entropy, that the supposed mechanism of variation, which is genetic mutations, doesn't actually work at bringing about evolution, because information is much more frequently lost by mutation than gained. And so with the amount being lost and the small amount being gained, this would never actually work. You would never actually be able to evolve anything if you do the statistics on it. And I thought that that was a very good argument. The second half focused more on the origin of life. So it focused on how there doesn't seem to be any possible naturalistic way to bring about life. They walk into an interesting experiment in the early 20th century where they tried to bring about the conditions early on in the history of Earth. And this experiment actually brought about amino acids, which at the time were thought to be the primary things that cause traits within creatures. But they showed that, first of all, that's no longer known. And instead, the focus is on DNA as the thing that causes traits. And they also show that the techniques done to measure this don't actually line up with any of the current standard secular accounts of what Earth's conditions actually were like at the beginning. And that was very interesting, especially the presence of oxygen, because the scientists who ran this experiment tried many different methods, and everything they did with oxygen was unable to form amino acids. In addition, the amino acids were immediately pulled out of the system, because if they were left in at all, they would pretty much immediately be destroyed again. So how could these ever have added up to form life as well? This was an interesting episode, but ultimately I actually felt this episode was unnecessary in the series, because a Catholic who believes in evolution, I think they could easily say, well, God, perhaps at that beginning, God created life. And I think we should only focus on things that would also be accepted by Catholic evolutionists, or at least theistic evolutionists, rather than focusing on critiquing a purely naturalistic account. I think that it's an interesting argument against a naturalistic view of the origin of life, and it's a serious issue for atheism, but it's not necessarily a serious issue with evolution, because this is something that we're presupposing for evolution. Right? Once we have a single-celled organism, how did that evolve into all life? Not merely how did the first single-cell organism get formed. From there we move somewhere in between a little bit, creation model building and critiquing the evolutionary views. They sort of focus on an evolutionary icon, another evolutionary icon, and this one is human evolution. Now, hold on, I'm just going to be gone for 1 second. I'm going to grab some water. I'll be back. All right, there we go. Yeah, I thought overall this episode was good. I moved on to the human evolution episode. Sorry, yeah. So within a human evolution episode, I thought that this was good, but it could have been a lot better. And perhaps I'm being somewhat critical because I'm very, very interested in the topic of human evolution. I just think human evolution is a fascinating topic. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in this from a creationist perspective is I'm just sort of wondering, what was the early history of humanity like? What was the time like around the time of the Tower of Babel, things right before the time of Abraham? I think that that's an important area for us to look into. And I've especially been very interested in this because of the work of Todd Wood. Todd Wood is a Catholic, or not Catholic, I think he's a Protestant biologist. I think his PhD is in biochemistry. And he's really, really wonderful. He has a great podcast called Let's Talk Creation. He's a very nice and honest guy. I mean, he'll admit when he thinks there's a good argument for evolution. I've seen atheists admit that his videos on the atheistic arguments for human evolution, the evolutionary arguments, are actually quite good. He has a good handle on the evidence, but also isn't been able to show that there are good arguments against human evolution as well. And my biggest critique of this episode is that they don't bring in Todd Wood's work. This is really the leading creationist work in human evolution. His paper, I think, was published in something like 2010, his first paper on the subject. So it's been out there for a while, and it's pretty easy to find. So I wish they had brought some of that work in. But that's some overall smaller critiques. They look at then Homo Neanderthal. Are Neanderthals humans? Or are these evidence of evolution? What they show is that no, Neanderthals were contemporary with humans for long amounts of time. Neanderthals have advanced culture. They actually have larger brains than us. They have it's been shown genetically that they interbreed with us. These were just humans. They make a whole focus thing of, no, these different human groups need to be renamed Homo sapien, but I don't think that's the case, right? Just like we're okay with saying that two different species of tigers came from an original tiger, even if we give them different species names. I don't see why we can't say these were different species of humans, so long as we're saying they both are descended from Adam and Eve. But that's a pretty minor critique, and I understand the rhetorical reason that they might want to say these are Homo sapiens. They then look at Homo erectus and again show that these had advanced culture. They had brains only very slightly smaller than ours. But in the case of both Neanderthal and erectus, we find that they have brain sizes within the normal range of human brains. So maybe they have a higher average or a lower average, but these are completely in line with normal human variation in height, normal human variation in walking patterns. They then look at Homo heidelbergensis, and they actually make the argument that Homo heidelbergensis is a combination of Homo erectus and Australopithecus, because the bones came from different levels and were accidentally mixed together. I don't know how much I buy this argument. It's definitely possible, but I'd be curious to ask someone like Todd Wood or another expert in this field what their opinions are on the subject. Because I know even if it's the case that Heidelbergensis is simply another human, Todd Wood's statistical modeling has shown that it's well within the range of an ordinary human and is significantly statistically separate from Australopithecus. And I think it would have been great if the series had at least brought in Todd Wood's work here to show that we don't even need to say that Heidelbergensis was actually a fake taxon, and maybe it is actually a real species. Then go into Homo naledi. I was really concerned at first when they suggested that Homo naledi was washed into the burial chamber, was washed into the cave rather than placed within a burial chamber, because Todd Wood has shown that's not the case. These are caves that you have to crawl like a mile to get to. These are very, very difficult to get to. We find humans of all sorts of different sizes there. Very clearly, this was indeed a burial. They also suggest possibly that it was multiple different species, which again is not the case, I know, because Todd Wood has walked through on his blog whether these could have been different species and shown no, it's clearly one species, not a mix of human and ape bones. The bones clearly fit together in a pattern of one creature. Now, that being said, they do seem to then move away from that opinion and towards the opinion that this is another variant of Erectus. And I thought that that was probably a much better solution to it. And they sort of present both. I couldn't tell. They seem to lean more towards my view that this is indeed just one creature, it's a human. But I don't think they really needed to bring up those earlier ones, or if they should have admitted that those are no longer good reasons. Then the second video, they go through this further and they bring in Australopithecus sabida. And they argue that sabida is like Heidelbergensis, a mix of different bones. But again, I don't think this is necessary because Todd Wood's work has shown that Australopithecus sabida is actually a human, significantly statistically different than every other Australopith ever discovered. And so it really should have been Homo sabida, not Australopithecus sabida. And the original scientists who published it were very uncertain of where to put it. And I think Todd Wood's work has shown it's just been misclassified. I don't think it needs to be multiple different species in order for us to escape that this was a transitionary form. But overall, I think the human evolution episodes were a lot better than I expected them to be. They're still very good. I just have some minor nitpicks about them because I'm very interested in this subject. I would still recommend them. All right, then they go episode 8. This is actually the 11th video at this point. They have an episode, The Failure of Big Bang Cosmology. I actually, again, found this one weaker for the same reasons I found the abiogenesis video weaker. These only argue that the universe could not have come about through natural causes, and that the Big Bang Theory has significant issues with it. But I'd rather focus more on putting forward the correct view in how we interpret the evidence than focusing on critiquing wrong views, especially because there isn't much of an effort put forward here for a Catholic cosmology of how we're going to explain cosmology from a young Earth perspective, simply more nitpicking the Big Bang perspective. And I wish they had done more what I call model building here, of actually trying to put forward a framework in which we interpret the evidence. All right, going forward from there, they then go to episode 10, video 13, on dating methods in the age of the Earth. This was a great, great video where they go in and show, first of all, why these radiometric dating methods aren't reliable and why carbon dating is actually extremely useful, because we find carbon-14, first of all, in dinosaur bones, and secondly, in diamonds. And carbon-14 can only be detected in something less than 50,000 years old. And even if we had perfect tools, less than 100,000 years old, but really in practice about 50,000 years old. And we find it in dinosaur bones, and they go and show why it couldn't have been leakage into it. And they actually talk about one of the scientists in the documentary went ahead and, what was I going to say? He went ahead and gave a presentation at a conference about carbon-14 found in dinosaur bones by testing done by a secular lab. And this presentation actually was later removed from the list of presentations that have been given at the conference because they argued that they must have been faulty science if they're finding carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. That's impossible. And so clearly there's a bias within the scientific community on issues of problems with carbon dating. Then they also showed that carbon-14 has been found in diamonds. And diamonds are actually formed in the upper mantle. So there's no way there could have been later leakage into the diamond, because this is formed inside the diamond when it's under the ground. The amount of carbon there is simply going to be the same there. I wish they had talked about a little bit why we are finding the carbon dates we are for some of this stuff that seems to be older than a creationist view. Because I think the best answer to this has been given by a number of creationists who've argued from looking at rock strata created by the flood that there seems to be a higher concentration of carbon in the atmosphere at that time. And that means there's going to be a higher percentage of carbon-12 to carbon-14, which means we should expect less carbon-14 in things, so they're going to end up being misstated to be older because they're incorrectly presuming the proportion of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the atmosphere at these times. All right, that was a very, very good video. Did I skip a video? Yes, I skipped episode 9. So episode 9, which is the 12th video, is interpreting the fossil record and the evidence for the Great Flood. This is a great video, pretty much just presenting standard arguments for catastrophist geology. This is probably one of the most well-developed areas of creationist science, and they do a very good job of presenting it, talking about things like catastrophic plate tectonics, how rock layers would have been formed. One of the interesting things is they talk about an experiment where rock layers were laid down, and talking about how they actually multiple layers were formed at the same time when these layers were formed in a lab in experimentation. So we could have easily had that during a flood where multiple layers would be formed. It wouldn't all just get jumbled up. When you actually do this in a lab, you get one layer on top of another on top of another, actually oftentimes at different densities, based on how the area that's getting brought in was being hit and laid down. So that was very good to discuss. And let's see. Yeah, that was just overall, it's a good basic video on that subject. I do wish they went more into this sort of approach, because from here they simply go on to discuss the consequences of it. And I wish they had more of a focus on model building from a Protestant, I think a lot of the Protestant science. So I would probably want to couple this series with the Is Genesis History and a lot of especially the extra videos done from the Is Genesis History series, which they've mostly uploaded to their YouTube channel, because that goes a lot more into not just critiques of evolution, but it focuses a lot more on putting forward a positive case for how we interpret the evidence in a creationist framework. And I think those need to be paired more, but there are other resources that have done a good job at that. So I'd highly recommend the work of the Is Genesis History project, not just the documentary, but also the extra footage they've put up as well. Yeah, and then finally, the last 3 episodes, so it's actually 4 videos, is the consequences of it. So they first start with the, what was it? I think they first start with the philosophical issues, and they go into things like, how eugenics was propagated because of evolution. I don't think people realize just how influential evolution was in the eugenics movement and just how widespread the eugenics movement was. There was a real attempt to push forward a changing of who humans are. This wasn't just Hitler. This was widespread in America as a movement. And then they talk about how this was rebranded into sort of the modern abortion rhetoric after the word eugenics became unpopular because of the Nazis. But still how a lot of this was grounded in evolutionary language, and that was all very good. They go into as well the political consequences of it. So they talk about how we now have this idea that we can just progress and change human nature because we evolved in the past. They talk about how this affects lots of different areas. I thought this was all good. My only problem is their political philosophy within some of this is oftentimes more influenced by liberalism than it is by a strictly Catholic view. So their critique of a progressive view of jurisprudence was argued for by putting forward a originalist view. But I think I'm not necessarily super anti-originalist like many Catholics are, but I think there are legitimate critiques of originalism from a Catholic perspective. And so I think it would have been good to put forward a more Catholic perspective on it, and focus more on that, and especially focus on the connection of some of capitalism and Darwinism as well. They focus on the connection of socialism and how Marx was very influenced by Darwin. Marx believed he was coming up with the social theory of evolution and completing the work Darwin had started, but they missed the influence that a liberal capitalism also had upon Darwinism, right? That Darwinism is essentially the idea that we can create all life through a free market of interaction over millions of years. And so I wish they had talked about that as well. Some of the political and economic philosophy is just very influenced, I think, by a sort of American liberalism, which I'm not as critical of as many traditional Catholics are. But I wish they had focused on that element as well. I think that would have been good. And yeah, so they talk about also the theological consequences and how there's no longer people are leaving the church, people aren't believing in the truth of the faith, and they're arguing that a lot of this comes from the fact that we've lost our trust in the story of Scripture because of evolution. And so overall, I want to recommend, this is a really great series. I highly, highly recommend it. If you want to get a copy, you can see the link below in the description. It's foundationsrestored.com, and you can either get it on DVD or digital. And then if you want to support the work I have here, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, like, comment, even just sharing these videos, even just watching them helps a lot. And so thank you everyone for watching, and have a good day.